Thank you very much, everybody, for making the time today. Today, we'll be talking about one of Natural Hazards Research Australia's new projects, testing and improving bushfire-prone area construction standards. And we'll go into a bit of the detail around that project, what we're looking to do, what the outcomes will be, and there'll also be an opportunity for you to ask any questions about the project. So we'll go through that detail. We'll have an FAQ at the end, and part of it will be talking to some of the end users as we look at them who are interested in doing this piece of work. But I'll introduce them more in a little bit. First, I'd like to just acknowledge that we come gathering today on a whole range of different lands from around the country. Thinking and paying respects to elders past and present from the different First Nations mobs around the country. I'm over in Western Australia, just outside of Perth. So I'm on Whadjuk Noongar country, and pay respects to elders past and present from those folks, and also to any First Nations folks who are joining us on this online briefing today. I think it's really important to really acknowledge that these lands have always been places of teaching and learning, and the topics we're talking about today about fire impacts on people and their housing been around for a long time, and it's good to see the centre working on those kind of challenges. This is a bit of a summary about what we'll cover today. So I'll introduce you to the folks who are involved in this presentation today, talk more, a little bit of an introduction to NHRA for those of you who haven't had any interactions with us at this stage. Then we'll talk a bit more about the project. So the project itself, what its objectives are, and I'll introduce you to Mark Holland from Country Fire Authority in Victoria, and he'll talk a bit more about the subject matter of this project. Then we'll talk about the governance and reporting sides of these kind of projects and how we run those through the centre. Talk about a bit more about the expression of interest process if you're interested in putting in a proposal to do this work. And as I mentioned, then we'll have some question time at the end so we can cover any details that we might have raised. So this is good folks who are involved in this online briefing today. So there's myself there. So I'm Brendan McAtee is my name, and I'm one of the node research managers within HRA. And I'm based in Perth and work with a lot of our participant organisations in WA and South Australia. There's Mark Holland, you can see there, Senior Manager for Land Use Planning and Country Fire Authority in Victoria. So very much a subject matter expert on what we're talking around today. So AS 3959 and the underpinning science for that. Then my colleagues in NHRA, so Lara Wedding and Louise, who are working on the back end of this to make sure it all runs smoothly. And they're also overseeing that EOI process and that administrative side of the project. So they'll be able to help you out if you have any questions, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So it's a quick summary of Natural Hazards Research Australia. So the centre has just entered its fifth year of operation, funded for a 10-year program from the Commonwealth Government. And you can see that 85 million over 10 years, but a big part of that, or extra part of that, is the partner contributions. And so the centre builds a very end-user focused research portfolio, and it's through these kind of programs that we build that end-user focused portfolio. So those partner contributions, both in terms of resources into the centre, but also the thought that goes on around knowledge gaps and challenges, is really important to us to build that response to natural hazards. So the core objective of the centre: protect human life and minimise harm and suffering, contribute to developing, supporting well-prepared and resilient communities, and invest in research that translates into action. So you can see, with those being the guides of what the centre is set up to perform, that there is a really important role that projects like this play in achieving NHRA's mission. So our role is really to encourage these kind of challenges to be presented to us, and then working with through these projects to solve those kind of challenges. This project in particular, so Australian Construction Standards AS 3959, so that provides national site assessment and construction requirements for buildings in bushfire-prone areas. So it's a standard which has been around for a while. It's one of those key parts of bushfire mitigation and preparedness. This project is about improving the safety outcomes for building occupants during a bushfire and enhanced community resilience based around the construction which happens under that standard. And if we look about the project description, and Mark will talk a little bit more about this shortly, we're talking about the science underpinning AS 395. When that standard was introduced, amendments to the standard since then have drawn on limited new science, and there remain many knowledge gaps. So this work is about filling in those kind of knowledge gaps. They include the performance and safety outcomes of various building design responses and combination of materials allowed under the standard at each bushfire attack level. This is a recognised need to augment the current knowledge base with new, robust, independent research. And that's a key part of that. So updating that knowledge base on which this standard is based is really at the core of this kind of work. And I will introduce Mark Holland, and he can tell you a bit more about what that might mean. So I'll throw over to you, Mark.
Yeah, awesome. Look, I'd probably just like to start by saying that this is probably in some of the most exciting research that I've been involved with in quite some time. I've been in that sort of bushfire building regulation space now for about 20 years. And I think, in that time, or particularly in the last 10, we probably haven't seen a project like this where I've seen, that really clear need with that really clear application for it at the end of the process. And hence, I guess, the excitement that I have around the project. Look, most would be aware in the audience that we've got our construction requirements, our national construction requirements under the NCC, the AS 3959, and the NAS standard is there as a deemed to satisfy solution as well, but it sort of sits outside of sort of generally what I'm about to say now, because it was a slightly different process for being developed and all the rest of it. But we have our national construction code. It's our deemed to satisfy solution. It's how most of our domestic construction ends up happening at the end of at the end of the process. People need to build to a BAL. They need to construct to AS 3959. So it plays a critical part in ensuring that we have resilient communities when areas are actually impacted by fire. So one of the issues with, or not issues, but one of the things that's important to consider with AS 3959 and all standards is that they're a consensus-based committee, that there's significant industry membership on those committees, and that for change to happen through that committee process, and rightly so, there needs to be a good, strong body of evidence. In more recent times, most of the research and most of that evidence has come from industry-driven research. So hence the need for this project, I guess, to test that fact that, or test that these things need to happen, I guess, on an independent basis from time to time. So we've got AS 3959, and then supporting AS 3959 as a construction standard, there's obviously the test standards, and predominantly 1530 Part 8.1 and Part 8.2 being those two bushfire tests. Now, again, they play a really important role in the process, and it'll probably sound like I'm diminishing them as test standards. It's important that they're repeatable. It's important that they can be done in a laboratory and all those sort of things. But we would say as a fire agency that they miss some pretty important aspects of what really happens in a bushfire event. The first and probably one of the most significant is that influence of wind. We lose houses on 40-degree days with 50, 60 kilometre an hour wind, 6% humidity. Obviously that has a real influence on how materials perform and what happens when a house is actually impacted. Again, on the left-hand side there, with an example of a scale test. It's one element of the building. When you add other elements like a deck, and we've got some examples in slides coming up, it's reasonable to assume that some of these elements won't necessarily perform in the real world as they're performing in the test. And the last one there is just that we've got the crib. So on the left-hand side, the crib becomes an important part of the test. It's recently changed to reflect leaves and twigs and things the Standards Committee would argue is more reflective in a bushfire environment. One of the issues from an AFAC perspective that we've been pushing back through that process of changing the crib was to say, well, that's not necessarily the only thing that a building is exposed to. So on the left-hand side there, we have what I would suggest is a fairly common way that a bushfire arrives at a building. It's probably less common that a building is actually faced by a nice radiant, a nice clear flame like AS3959, which would assume radiating on the building. We see, these elements around, as that ember attack starts to happen, those elements around the building starting to burn and starting to expose different parts of the building. And the left-hand side is a really good example of that. We've got the doormat that's burnt through the deck. The photo below, it's a wheelbarrow. There's something else that's burnt. There's been some pretty significant exposure on the side of that building. If it was a different form of construction, you'd probably argue that the building still wouldn't be there. A similar example is that sort of direct flame contact issue, and a lot would be familiar with the work from CSIRO. Lost track of exactly how long ago it was now, but say 2012 or the like, that showed that when you expose buildings to large flames, the flames tend to wrap and interact around that building. AS3959 allows for a level of shielding. This is a pretty live issue in New South Wales at the moment, and a lot of pushback around what construction requirements should be on the lee side of the building, and just how those large flames interact with the building when the building's exposed to them. The other important point there is just around in the research is around that we're looking for appropriate and cost-effective construction requirements as well. So it's easy to say, well, just build the whole building, as Balef said. It's much harder to, you need that evidence base to justify that. You also need a cost-effective approach to responding to it. Two examples, sort of just showing what can come out of AS3959. On the right-hand side there, we would say a really good example of Balfour construction. On the left-hand side there, would suggest that somebody's followed all the weaker points within the standard to produce arguably an outcome that's not going to perform as the standard is assuming it will. We've put timber cladding on the front of an AC sheet. Our garden around the building is probably laid out in a way that's going to produce that sort of maximum exposure to the building. So I guess it's the crux of the project is questioning some of these sorts of approaches and what's allowed in certain circumstances. We've got just another example there. This building's down in the Surf Coast somewhere. It's up on the internet. There's an award-winning example of a Bal 29 home. You might look at that facade at the end there with the window on and say, well, if you expose that to radiant heat, it's not going to have embers or any other types of fuel sitting next to it. It might start to perform as the standard assumes it would. However, if you look on the left side and we've got two combustible wall surfaces facing each other, we've got a combustible deck surface, they're all radiating heat back in on each other. It might be allowable under the standard, but we would say potentially won't lead to the outcomes that the standard's assuming it will. And conveniently there in this photo, they've also put that other piece of fuel, that wooden stool in there to add to all that process as well. So I guess in our, the way that I look at it, the idea of this project is to say, well, these things are potentially allowable under the standard, but if we test them at different scales, if we test some of these different scenarios, are we actually seeing the outcomes that I guess the performance requirements in the NCC and community are expecting to see out of these construction requirements? And I'll hand back to Brendan.
Yes, I think we can see some of the complexities in this project from that description. And as I say, at the end of this, we'll have a question time. So if you've got any of those technical questions that you'd like to ask Mark about this project and the scope of work that we're talking about, then that'll be the time to do those things. Let's talk a little bit about the expected outputs. and we've touched on a number of these already. But there is a research will underpin policy relating to the application of AS 3959. So really about building that evidence base on which that standard is based and looking at those different possibilities that Mark was showing through his slides. Key elements of this research. So identify potential limitations in the testing and construction requirements of AS 3959 and standard methods of construction. So a little bit of referring to what Mark was talking about there. And importantly, this is a physical measurement program. So design and testing regimes intended to provide an evidence base for improved construction outcomes. And you can see an example just described there. Testing regime may be at various scales, may involve small-scale wind tunnel experiments and/or full-scale testing and building performance against fully developed fire scenarios. And so we'll talk a little bit about it as we go on, but they are the kind of things that we're looking for folks such as yourselves who'd like to apply for this project. What are those, looking at that testing regime, what do we think is really going to provide the evidence base that we're looking for? So specific areas of investigation related to that include, but we're always looking for that innovation and really tapping into the knowledge of the academic sector as to what might make these things better. Performance of common materials when combined in standard methods of construction, when combustible decking interfaces and combustible cladding material, or the effect of combustibles on the inside of windows. And we saw a bit of reference to that in the examples that Mark showed. Effective furnishings and other combustibles adjacent to building elements of different types, materials, and configurations. And the assumptions around shielding and reducing the BAL to BAL 40 on the lee side of a building in BAL FZ in the fire zone. Continuing on the work that we're getting done in this project, so impact of different methods of construction on recovery and how standards might better support recovery post-exposure to bushfire as well. So not just in the actual time of fire, but what happens after that, how can construction lead to different scenarios and outcomes there. Importantly, the cost versus bushfire performance of different methods and materials of construction. So all those Mark referred to in there, and there's all important outcomes from this piece of work. I think important to note there as well, the intent of this research is to focus on construction measures and outcomes. It's not about revising or thinking of different methodologies for the site assessment, the bushfire attack level determination methodology under AS 3959. So that work around the assessment methodologies is generally out of scope for this kind of work. Is there any comment you'd like to make there on that at this stage, Mark?
No, not really. I think that's a whole nother body of work. So I guess we're not suggesting it's not an important area of research and an area where we can potentially improve over time. But I guess we're just trying to be clear that this is more focused on that constructed form that you get at the end of the process. So.
Excellent, thank you. So though we talked about the project outputs, this is now moving to those core outputs, which are those outputs that come from all of NHRA's projects which we invest in. So literature review and engagement with industry, fire authorities and regulators to determine perceived limitations and potential improvements to bushfire construction requirements. So strong reporting requirement out of this project and a really quite a large engagement component to this project as well. Report detailing research findings and recommendations relating to application of AS 3959 construction requirements and testing standards to the references that Mark talked about before. So there's building a strong evidence base and bringing together those data sets is important to this. As a note there, set of data and ancillary information from experiments to be made available for further analysis. So the data collection is important alongside the reporting and description of outcomes. That'll be included in a final report. Stakeholder presentation. So one of the excellent things about the centre is the investment in communications to make sure that the work that we do gets out to those who can use it. So stakeholder presentations are certainly part of that, and also maintaining the academic side of the work that we're doing as well, and recognising the importance of that work and what benefits academics and researchers as well. So looking for academic publications out of this work where appropriate as well. Then I'll just talk about these as the artifacts of our program. project management system. So we work on a quarterly reporting basis. We talked about project reports and relevant communications outputs as we go through the project process. There might be presentations to stakeholders. There are a number of channels which our research gets out through as well. One of those is a hazard note, maybe later in the project, as we seek to make sure that everybody who can use this information gets hold of this information. And as I mentioned, that commitment to the innovation side of the work that we do as well. So any innovative outputs that the team can deliver in terms of that built form and that construction and the information on how to do that better, those are the kind of things that we're interested in. So if we think about that's the work that we're looking to get done, and the centre is very much committed to those utilisation, impact, and making communities safer. So anticipated outcomes, these are the kind of things that we're expecting to come out of this. There will be the outcomes from this based on the outputs that we get from the measurement program. So acknowledge that natural hazard emergencies are expected to continue, become more complex and unpredictable. So this is part of the work in the built environment around helping communities become more resilient. Intended that the research comes from this project will be usable and actionable by the people who need to use it. So, and we see the potential there is saving lives and thousands of dollars from average build of homes on bushfire-prone land if we get better construction approaches under the standard. And then underpinning land use planning policy, research for bush and other fires demands that strong scientific evidence base. And so this is really about updating that evidence base and providing that data for the working community and the industry to be able to use in this space. And this can flow into policy and upgrades to the relevant standards where that's appropriate from the work that's done and the results that come out of here. And I think then the final bit there, around resilience to bushfires and the community perspective, and also thinking about future construction and the possibilities of identifying alternative cost-effective methods for creating those bushfire adaptive buildings. So there's a lot of work that can be done in here, and it also you can see has a lot of potential kind of outcomes which have a lot of benefit for fire in the community, environment, and industry. Put this slide in here around collaboration. Collaboration is the essence of what the centre is really about, and we saw earlier that part of this work is not just doing the work, but really that engagement with the community and industry as well is really important. And so when we review the kind of proposals that we're expecting to see around this, understanding and description of that collaborative element of the research is really important for us to see as well. So it's quite an extensive project. There's been a lot of physical testing to go on. Budget envelope between $900,000 to $1 million over a time frame up to 3 years is what we're expecting for this project. If you've seen the project page for this project on NHRA's website, you'll see there are links to the expression of interest document that you'll use to apply for this project, but also the budget spreadsheet as well. And that's really important to fill out when we're talking about the costing of these projects. So when we do our assessment of the applications that come in, we understand where the money is being spent. So that please use that budget spreadsheet to articulate how the cost of the project comes to be. So talking a little bit more about the project management side and the governance and reporting side. So when we put out these projects to successful research providers, we're looking to contract with a single research provider. So that might be a university or consultants, but the contract is one single provider, and it's completely okay for there to be subcontractors under the research provider that we work with, but that subcontracting is organised by that lead provider. So we, in our centre, only contracts with the lead provider out of that. As I mentioned, contract is with the Natural Hazards Research Australia. The way we run our projects, we look to take a fairly lean approach. So we have a project management committee, which will comprise of a couple of the key end users and the research leads that really form that management committee around the project that's close to the project and make those decisions about the best pieces of the work that need to be done and the research program and those kind of elements. For bigger projects where there are benefits more widely into the sector in various places, we can also set up a steering committee, which is a can be a number of stakeholders in the project that we're working on that helps us with socializing research and getting feedback into the research program so that we're staying on the right track. We work on a quarterly meetings basis for our project management committees and our project reporting. That doesn't mean there are no meetings more frequently than that, and we like to set up the right cadence for those, but at least a quarterly reporting cycle is what we work on. In terms of the projects themselves, so we work pretty collaboratively on a project plan that marries up what we want to get done from the end user and stakeholder perspective with the research providers. Series of milestones, nothing new there. As mentioned, quarterly progress reporting, project evaluation reporting at the end, and then that commitment to stakeholder presentations to make sure research gets into the hands of the people who needs to use it. So you will have seen, so this is part of our expression of interest process, this online briefing. There's information there on the website, which you can find there, which you hopefully have already found, but there's more information there. And as I mentioned, you'll find links on that page to the expression of interest document, the budget spreadsheet, the forms of our contracts that we use, because they're important to work with as well. Centre contacts. So for any questions you might have after the end of this briefing, please email research@naturalhazards.com.au. That's the channel to use for any questions, and that will be passed on to the right people to answer those questions. And in the submission of the expression of interest, certainly the EOIs should be prepared using the Centre's EOI submission template, which I mentioned you can find on the website. When you're ready to submit those, to submit them to research@naturalhazards.com.au. And that's where they'll be collected. And the cutoff date for these ones is 5 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on Friday, the 10th of April. So that's a little bit about the expression of interest process. A little bit more about the detail of what those submissions look like, and this is all very well laid out in those expression of interest documents. So it's really important for us to understand the capability of the research team that you're bringing together. That's a major factor in our assessment. Statement about not just the team, diversity and inclusion is very important as well. So, and that can be across a number of different elements. Projects, any inclusion and respect of First Nation peoples. So it's important to make a statement relating to the project about inclusion and thinking in those respects as well. General description of how the project team intends to approach the project. So that project approach is very important, and you'll see that with guidance laid out in the document. This is along with the proposal, is that indicative schedule of milestones and progress of how the research will proceed and what will it include. That's really important. That's not set in stone. We have a process of co-design to go through once we've identified the preferred provider. But that milestone really is and that schedule is really important from the perspective of us being able to understand, right, this research team really knows what needs to be done here, and the timing and schedule they put together certainly makes sense. And then the project, of course, the project budget, including any details of in-kind contributions from research organisations as well. That's important to us to understand the commitment to this project and making sure that all the resources needed for successful outputs will be in place. And as I mentioned, there's the project spreadsheet that the centre provides, which we would like you to use. Other elements there, so really around outcomes, outputs, and demonstrating the involvement of the research team with the relevant stakeholders, in this sector. And we've heard from Mark and referred to a number of those user groups within this project. But I think the important things here is to think about the centre is really aiming to make sure that there is impact from the research that we invest in. So understanding and presenting a clear understanding of the impact that this work can have and what outcomes that it can have is really important in the submission. Clear statement around the outputs is really important, and how those outputs relate back to the impact that this project is trying to have. is really important as well. We mentioned the importance of stakeholder engagement. We also look at it from submissions from a risk perspective as well and a value for money perspective. So, some thought that goes into what risks might be there to the successful implementation of this project is important to us as well. Any requested changes to the centre's proposed form of contract. So there is a part in our EOI document that asks you to review the contract that NHRA works with, and if there are any questions or problems or things we might need to discuss around that contract, please put those into this document here, because we like to know those up front, rather than just finding out there are challenges from a contracting perspective a bit down the track. So we're always looking for any of those questions or challenges to be recorded in this document. And then, of course, really good succinct description of the caliber and capabilities of the research team. So up to 2-page CVs for each proposed project team member. That's important for this application process as well. And we certainly recognise as well find that balance between recognising that not every research team will have everybody in it at the moment. There might be some postdocs or other researchers need to be recruited into a team. That's okay. Certainly call that out. But we're certainly seeking to find that balance between existing research capability and building a team, particularly for the purpose of this project. So I mentioned the assessment of applications that we get in for the applications that we receive. And you can see there that this will be the assessment weighting for this particular project. So they're the categories that we assess on. So research capability, project approach, project outcomes and outputs, industry engagement and value for money. And you'll see in the EOI documents that there's space for replying to each of those criteria and providing the relevant details in there. So we can see here that particularly in this project, the approach, we want to see a lot of the detail around that and really be able to understand that it's addressing the challenges that we've set. And the other part of it is for this one as well, the value for money. So we're really wanting to make sure that the testing program that's described in here is value for money in terms of producing the outputs that we want to see, but also managing that, that risk against not getting those outcomes and making sure that we're getting resources put into what we consider the right elements of the program. It's good. So you can see here that this is the timeline. So where the submissions opened on the 26th of February. We're at the online briefing on the 18th of March there. Our submissions are open till the 10th of April. Then we'll go into an assessment period of those, which we hope to have concluded and be able to let people know by the middle of May. And then that's the process after that, after we've identified the preferred provider, working on that project proposal. And I mentioned that co-design fashion so that we've got that up and going and ready for project to start. That's the kind of time frame that we're looking at. So that's all about the project. Thank you for attending today and learning more about their expression of interest progress and this particular project. Questions after this briefing can go to research@naturalhazards.com.au. You'll also be able to submit the proposal there as well. You'll see on the project page as well that we will update that with any of the questions that we're about to go through at the moment on those FAQs will be available at that website, which hopefully you've found already. So with that, I will open it for questions. So I'll open the floor for questions that you might have about this project, and that can be about the governance side from NHRA or the technical side as well. We have Mark here, and we might have a couple of the other colleagues as well. So please, I'll throw the floor open for any questions.
My name is Luis from the University of Queensland, from Brisbane. I have a question regarding the objectives. There are mainly 3 objectives in the proposal, and I would like to know if there is any priority on these 3 objectives. So if there's any one that's more important than the others. What are the expectations from in our NHRA? And the other question would be related with the in-kind contribution. What is the level expected of in-kind contribution with respect to the cash?
So in-kind contributions, we don't set a particular level for those. I think it's part of our process just to see what that in-kind contribution is from the various research providers that tells us a story about about the project proposal itself. So whatever's appropriate for your institutions and those kind of things is what we're interested in seeing. We don't set a prescribed level.
Okay.
And then in terms of the priorities of the outcomes, I might ask Mark, do you have any thoughts on the priorities of what you like to see from this project?
No, I don't think there's any particular standout. I'm just trying to think in terms of objectives. Are we talking about the expected outputs, or exactly which were the three objectives that we were referring to? So,
Is that sorry, Mark, for yourself, Lewis, is that around the outputs? Is that your
Yeah, because there are three main basically objectives or outcomes that you are looking for: the impact of wind on the lee side, elements or objects left outside the buildings, and then the contribution of each element to the system. So my question is any of these have priority over the other two? The other question, which I assume the answer is no, but I need to ask it just to be sure, if are you expecting us to tackle all these three in the proposal?
yes, yeah. So I'd suggest they're all on a fairly even playing field in terms of our needs. So
does that answer the three
Yeah, so
fairly even components? Yep.
basically it is expected that we tackle every single outcome or that is proposed in the document, right?
Yes, I think that would be right. And certainly we're interested from the assessment panel perspective of seeing what is that program of research you could propose. So we're not really, I guess, prescribing the actual research elements. We'll leave that up to experts like yourself, Lewis. But so we can see what's the program of research, how does it address those outcomes?
Thank you.
I have a question, Alex Wilco from Melbourne Uni. I just put it in the chat. It's probably easier for Mark to answer. And just adding to this question, so you would like to see, let's say, how additional exposure elements could be incorporated in S 1530.8. Is that part of the project?
yeah, so I guess we wouldn't want to limit it to one direction or the other, and whether the outcomes of the research are to suggest how the 1530 standards need to change or better reflect a bushfire exposure, or whether there's tests in addition to those that might be needed, or whether it's just about, well, those tests do a certain amount of things, but when we undertake research at different scales, we know that when we bolt some of those different outcomes together, that it doesn't quite perform as expected. So that it might be a set of recommendations around how those standards are applied, as opposed to whether they necessarily need to change. So I think it could be either, and I probably wouldn't want to preempt the research by saying it needs to be one or other.
Yeah. So are you suggesting that, let's say, trying to implement additional exposures, like for example, amber shower, as a part of 1530.8, is it a part of this project, or not mandatory, let's say, or not?
Yeah, I'd say not mandatory, but if the outcomes of the research was to suggest, based on these, this approach we've taken, based on, that there's another chapter to the standard, or that there's an additional additions or changes that might be made to the current test. I think they're all on the table. I think in the first instance, it's about saying, well, it's about digging into the advice and some of the criticisms and some of the different positions that people have had about the outcomes of what the standard produces over the last sort of 10 years that it's been in place, and our surveys we've done post-fire, to say, well, we've tested some of those assumptions. However, again, we were pretty careful in the EOI not to dictate how those testing and things needed to happen. I think that needs to fall out of that initial literature review and the research of itself, and then lead into those recommendations. And I wouldn't want to jump ahead and suggest what those recommendations should look like. And so like I said, might be changes. We might be suggesting changes to the current test standards. We might be suggesting a whole new test standard. I think in my mind, they would all be on the table.
Thank you.
Just reading your question there, though, Alex, what we're suggesting isn't on the table is trying to unpack the site assessment methodology, how radiant heat is calculated on the building in the first instance. And I think, like I said, not because that's not necessarily important, but Lewis's question before about which of the objectives is more important is leading to the fact that it's already a pretty broad project proposal. And if we started bringing some of those sorts of elements into it as well, it would just, I guess, just incorporate everything and just be very hard to sort of manage to appropriate outcomes.
Thank you. And I just noted a bit of a follow on that in the chat from Stephen Halliday. Did you want to just ask a bit more about that, Stephen? It follows on a little bit from what Alex was talking about and Mark's response just then.
Yeah, sorry, it was sort of just to clarify, because just going back, we said that the site assessment was not a part of this. And I mean, it kind of directly influences, like, if someone screwed up and it was meant to be a Bell F set instead of a Bell 40, you're going to have a bad day, no matter sort of what you use. So we're working under the assumption that the exposure from at least a radiant heat perspective we'll keep that level, but the presence of additional combustible elements, the influence of wind, the co-contribution of multiple elements together that are typically tested independently, but evaluated with co-contribution as well. That's what we're trying to sort of focus this on. Because again, just as a bit of background, this is what we've been burning these things for close to 2 decades now and developed those standards. So we've seen a lot of those co-contribution issues in test parameters, and people assuming, say, Bell F set's fine if you use it everywhere else, but there tends to be sacrificial burning elements. So, okay. It was more about, right, we're not, the aspects of the test standard we might need to look at in terms of contributions to exposure, but at least if we put a ring fence around and say 12.5 to 40 in Bell F set is still an acceptable exposure range.
So I think where you started, it's about assuming, if the outputs of the site assessment methodology gives you X, working on the fact that it's X, what are the outcomes, rather than trying to unpack how we get to that in the first instance as well. So the assumed radiant heat exposure out of the different BAL levels, or that long flame exposure onto a building because it's already BAL F set.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. Any other questions, clarifications?
Yeah, I've got one to ask. I guess, is there any preference in trying to focus on the areas where there's the most likelihood of meaningful change within the standard, rather than sort of tackling areas that are a really entrenched position of AS 3959 where even with a certain degree of evidence, it's still likely that the way the standard moves forward, they're going to say hunker down on certain positions, like trying not to change the scope of the standard because it's more of a an attitudinal approach or an entrenched position to not consider certain things, even though there's a fair bit of evidence that they might have effect, like external furnishings. The standard says in the scope, we're not considering those external elements. We can provide more and more evidence that they're that they're significant and prolific in real bushfire events, but yet the standard says our entrenched position is we don't want to consider them. While there's other sort of soft areas where you could influence the moisture content of materials for testing or shift certain things, subfloor provisions and things like that are more subtle and could sway quite quickly with new evidence.
Great question. I'm still contemplating. I think in a way I'd kind of like to see both, I suppose, and whether that first step, which is the literature review, that kind of resolves the fact that that's been shown, there's a body of evidence there, and taking it further is of limited value, so that we can focus in a different space. Then I would say yes. Jackson Parker is on the line as the AFAC FP20 rep. He might have a slightly more informed view about pushing some of these issues through the standards process. But yeah, I don't see that there's any value to the community if we go out and retest things that are already confirmed, and there's a body of evidence there showing that that's the case. It might be helpful for our FP20 reps to have that body of evidence really clearly articulated, and they're in a nice, neat little document or the like for them to take, or body of evidence. But yeah, then I think we sort of focus that testing in the next steps of the research, potentially, where we think we're perhaps going to get the most traction.
Thanks for that, Mark. I know Jackson's online. Did you have any comment you wanted to make on that, Jackson?
Yeah, I think a couple of things there is, I guess, with the external elements, where I guess it's kind of valid verifying or testing the limits of the crib, so the AE and the AA crib. So does the A crib or the AA crib, appropriately represent external elements? In my view, the debris of twigs and leaves are proposed to be represented by the AA crib. However, they're not the only external fuel sources to a house. So I think in other areas, people have mentioned gardens and mulch. So the standard, as it stands at the moment, doesn't prevent you from applying mulch up to the edge of the house or having grass up to the edge of the house. So that there's no kind of clear pathway of non-combustible material requirement to the exterior of the house at this point in AS 3959. And the other ones, like Mark mentioned, was the testing standards of AS 1530, 8.1 and 8.2. So part of that would also be, validating or critically reviewing those testing standards, so that they currently don't consider wind. And obviously the crib sizes are part of those standards as well. So the non-use of wind is a significant question mark in those standards, given that under bushfire conditions you're likely to have significant winds, and that can change something from charring to flaming potentially. So those kind of assumptions and testing those, and then I think in the scope of AS 3959, if we have evidence to support challenging the scope, so if the evidence supports that elements outside the building other than just twigs and leaves can have a significant effect on the performance of the building, then having that as peer-reviewed research to challenge that scope would be useful.
Thanks, Jackson. Just mindful of time, there's one more question in the chat from Lena. Have you had a chance to look at that one, Mark? I'm curious to know the parameters for the idea of shielding on the leeward side of the building. Could this extend to investigating external structures such as verandas, retaining walls, decks, and other landscape elements?
I think it would have to extend to actual parts of the building. So, I think decks are potentially a little bit different to the broader landscaping elements because they all, and this perhaps ties into Justin's question before, there's a limit in scope to what the standard actually applies to. But some of these elements are equally additional exposures to the building as the doormat or other things that we might, you might naturally see around a building and create that additional fire load. So, I think to a point, I think they would be included. I think the decks definitely and those sorts of attachments to a building. And then I guess it's a little bit like some of the comments from the start. Just how far do you go? The scope of this project could get fairly significant fairly quickly if we started trying to draw in all those broader landscaping elements and those sorts of things as well.
Thanks, Mark. And I think that's a good place for us to draw this briefing to a close with that comment just in that you made there, just Mark. So what we really want to see in the proposals for this one is really, the research perspective on what can be done to address that scope of work within the project resources that we have available. So, looking for the best, for those descriptions of the work that needs to be done, that we'll have those, produce the kind of outputs that we're looking for. Analysis of that research program of testing that's proposed is what we'll really be looking at. So, with that, I'd say thank you very much for everybody spending the time today. The team from NHRA supporting this, we saw Lara and Louise and also our comms folks as well that make this possible. Really, thanks to them for making the time, everybody for joining, and Mark and Jackson for answering their questions as well. So thank you very much. Look forward to seeing the proposals to do this piece of work come in. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day.